So the reflection comes from the Reverend Sandra Houghton, who is a retired minister from Sale. I would have to confess to having a soft spot for Thomas, who famously doubted the disciples' witness to the resurrection, as he struggled to believe that it could be true. My fondness for Thomas is not so much because of his struggle to believe, but rather because he is a flawed person. He makes mistakes and he says things rather bluntly. This he has in common with Peter, who is famous for putting his foot in his mouth and saying the wrong thing. This is also something that my family and friends remind me that I do a lot. Thomas struggles to come to believe in Jesus' resurrection. He struggles, and especially the way in which Jesus responds to his dilemmas and treats him so lovingly, gives me heart. As I know that I am a flawed person too, poor Thomas. He has gone down in history, labelled forever as Doubting Thomas. What a label to put on a person. As if the rest of those who were fortunate enough to see the risen Christ, would have had doubts if they hadn't seen Jesus with their own eyes. Let's face it, even those who saw the risen Christ struggled to make sense of what their eyes could see, but their minds couldn't. At least at first, understand by being true. Remember that when Jesus first appeared to the disciples in the locked room, they struggled to believe that it was their beloved Lord standing in their midst. It was only when they had the opportunity to see his wounded hands and his side that they believed it really was him. And yet, Mary Magdalene had already told them that she had seen the risen Lord. Didn't they believe her? Well, by the reaction, clearly they hadn't believed her. I remember a minister saying that when Jesus first greeted the disciples with "Peace be with you," that they wouldn't have taken it in, as they would have been too perplexed and shocked. However, by the time that Jesus said, "Peace be with you," a second time, he was probably shouting to make himself heard above the din. Such a hullabaloo would have broken out when they truly realised that it really was him standing among them. Did Jesus censor them for their struggle to believe that he had risen from the dead, or for not believing Mary Magdalene's witness when she told them of her encounter with Jesus in the garden? No, indeed. Instead of the censor, he provided them with what they needed from him to be able to believe. He spoke to them and showed them his wounded hands and side. Thomas had the misfortune to not be with the rest of the disciples when Jesus appeared to them, and he did not believe their testimony of encountering the risen Jesus. We can argue that the witness to the resurrection by all those who were in the locked room should have been convincing. However, it remains that Thomas was not convinced of the truth of their testimony and set out his conditions of belief. Interestingly, most of these conditions are ones that Jesus had already fulfilled for the rest of the disciples. The only addition to that, Thomas wanted to touch the wounds and the hole in the Jesus' side, probably to reassure himself that it was not a ghost that the others had seen, but rather a real flesh and blood person. When the risen Jesus encountered Thomas, he did censor Thomas for his struggle to believe and for the conditions he imposed for belief. No, he did not. Instead, he graciously offered Thomas all that he required for belief. He invited Thomas to put his fingers on the marks of his wounded hands and put his hand in the hole in his wounded side. This was truly compassionate love at its best. Jesus gently and graciously invited Thomas to give up his unbelief. The heart of this story is not Thomas nor the disciples' lack of faith, but rather the way in which Jesus so graciously offered himself. To Jesus, it appears that Thomas's faith was more important than the grounds of his faith. So Jesus presented to him his post-resurrection body and exhorted him, "Do not be unbelieving, but believing." This generous offer of grace from Jesus led Thomas to a confession of faith. It was a demonstration of the way that Jesus continued to care for his sheep. Jesus' love for his own did not end with his death. Rather, this story acts to inform us that Jesus' love, compassion, and care for his followers continues. The blessings that Jesus confers to the end of this story is a blessing on all who will follow. He says, blessed are those who have not seen and yet come to believe. It is our blessing, a blessing pronounced by Jesus for our benefit, as we are part of that cloud of witness who have followed in the footsteps of Thomas and the other disciples. We are among those who believe despite not seeing with our own eyes the risen Christ. Sometimes our believing might be fragile, reflecting the kind of doubt and struggle that Thomas experienced. But Jesus does not censor the one who has doubts and struggles. Rather, he will seek to give them what they need for faith. Being perfect is not a prerequisite for experiencing the love and forgiveness of Jesus Christ. And isn't that good news for us? None of us are perfect, least of all me. Yet Jesus calls to us, as he did Thomas, offering love, grace, forgiveness, guidance, and strength. Thanks be to God.